Most of the 2 million British visitors who come to Tenerife each year, we travel by plane. But with the issue of climate change so high up the agenda these days, more and more of us are beginning to worry about the impact that all that jetting around has. The trouble is, we've all become rather fond of our holidays abroad, haven't we? So the idea that we should avoid flights altogether means a sacrifice that I think most people simply aren't prepared to make. But now we're being told there's an alternative. We can make up for the damage that our flights do to the environment by simply ticking the little box on our booking form that says carbon offsetting. But does that genuinely benefit the environment? Or is it just a wheeze to get more money out of us while easing our conscience about flying? These days, climate change is rarely out of the news, with everyone from protesters to celebrities blaming air travel as a key cause of damage to the environment.
There's an emergency that it's a race against time, and one in which we are losing.
Even some airlines are beginning to suggest that we should think twice before we book a flight.
Do you always have to meet face to face? Could you take the train instead?
So perhaps it's not surprising that some of us are beginning to feel guilty about travelling by air for our holidays. Like Stuart Carter, he's a keen traveller who uses his holidays to see as much of the world as possible. But recently, he's begun to worry about the impact that this might be having on the environment.
So in the summer of 2018, I actually flew to Japan and got lost in the mountains in a camper van, which was a fantastic trip. And on the flight on the way back, that's when I realised that if we're going to go flying around all the time and, burning the planet, that's not going to exist anymore. I want to be able to look my nephew in the eye when he says to me, Uncle Stu, what did you do to prevent this climate change? I want to be able to honestly say, these are the things I did my bit.
Well, while it remains a hot topic, scientists agree that the Earth's climate is warming up, with a key cause of that reckoned to be the huge amount of carbon dioxide, or CO2, being pumped into it by human activity. Things like manufacturing, power generation, and motor vehicles are all adding to this problem. And fuel-guzzling air travel is generally recognised as one of the most environmentally unfriendly things you can do. Some airlines are trying to do something about this, investing in schemes to counteract the damage. Chief among them is carbon offsetting, when you pay money to green causes to supposedly match the impact of your flight. But some people, including Stuart, tell us they're struggling to understand how these payments can work.
So looking at Ryanair's carbon offsetting, it's a fixed donation of €5. But flights are different lengths, they're flying all over the place. How do we know what happens to that €5? Where does it go to?
Most of the major airlines now offer voluntary carbon offsetting schemes. You're likely to pay just under £8 for every tonne of carbon that your journey creates. But it's not always easy to understand how your donation might help the planet. Stuart wants to know what the true value of carbon offsetting is.
I'm not the sort of person who settles for not knowing things. And so, if I'm going to do my carbon offsetting, I would dearly like to know that my money is going to sensible places that's having an impact.
So we've taken him just a stone's throw from Heathrow Airport to try and find some answers. John Buckley runs a company that offers solutions, identifying ways of taking CO2 back out of the environment to slow down the effect of global warming.
Hi John, good to meet you.
John's going to help Stuart work out how much CO2 his next flight will generate, what's known as the carbon footprint. He's already booked to go to the Canary Islands with the budget airline Jet2.
So I've booked my flight to Tenerife. How is the carbon footprint of that calculated?
Okay, so we can have a look using our carbon calculator on our website. So here we go. So whereabouts were you flying from?
We'll be flying from East Midlands,
East
EMA.
Midlands, EMA, yeah. And flying to
TFS.
TFS, Tenerife.
When calculating how much CO2 one individual passenger is responsible for putting into the atmosphere on a flight, you have to consider all sorts of factors, including the age and design of the aircraft, how full it is, and the distance it's going to be travelling. John's calculator uses emissions factors provided by the UK government to give a rough figure.
So if we now hit the calculate button, we get the answer. So it's 0.94 tonnes, so just a smidgen under 1 tonne of carbon dioxide for your return trip to Tenerife.
0.94 tonnes of CO2 is the equivalent to driving from London to Edinburgh and back 4 times, and nearly a third of the maximum amount of CO2 scientists say each of us should produce in a year if we're to prevent climate change. Quite a statistic. But will paying for carbon offsetting really offset these emissions? One of the things it most commonly pays for is planting trees, which are like sponges, soaking up CO2 or sequestering it, to use the technical term.
Over its lifetime, depends on how much space it has to grow, but potentially, if it's given space to grow and lives to, say, 50 years, it could sequester about a tonne of carbon dioxide, which would match your flight.
50 years seems an awfully long time to balance things out, so it's worth remembering that carbon offsetting doesn't just fund trees. John's company is one of many that additionally offers all sorts of other schemes to counteract CO2.
We support all sorts of projects, so we support renewable energy projects, so wind farms, solar panel farms, and also small hydropower as well. And we also support clean drinking water projects as well. And they're all good projects, and they all do great in terms of reducing carbon emissions or taking carbon out of the atmosphere.
The calculator tool shows exactly how much John's company thinks Stuart would need to pay towards each project to soak up the CO2 that will be generated by his flight. In this case, John thinks it would cost him between £5 and £13. But why is that more than Ryanair's €5 charge?
I mean, different projects around the world would have different prices just because they're different technologies and different things need to happen to make them happen. A tree planting programme or a reducing deforestation project is quite different to a wind farm and solar power project in a different part of the world.
To find out more about the different values that airlines are putting on offsetting their flights, Stuart has come to West London Aero Club at White Waltham Airfield to meet Jill Starley-Grainger, editor of JetSetJourneys.com. She's looked at 5 well-known British airlines to see what kind of carbon offsetting they offer when you book your ticket. She's discovered that only 2 of those, British Airways and Ryanair, offer any carbon offsetting at the checkout. As Stuart already knows, Ryanair suggests a €5 flat rate donation, while British Airways offers the choice of donating to an environmental charity, or you can opt to contribute to specific carbon offsetting schemes.
The problem is, it says that by donating this certain amount of money, you can make your flight carbon zero, which sounds great, doesn't it?
It does sound brilliant, yep.
But I've compared their calculations to various other carbon calculators on the internet, and that's where you discover the problem. All of the calculations are hugely different.
Stuart's already been told by John that his return flight to Tenerife with Jet2 will generate almost 1 metric tonne of CO2. But when Jill looked it up on BA's own calculator, she got a very different answer.
For your flight from Nottingham to Tenerife, the closest I could find for BA was Gatwick to Tenerife. So when I did the calculation on their website, it said you would be emitting 0.26 tonnes of CO2.
So the airline's calculator suggests Stuart's flight would produce around a quarter of the CO2 that John's calculator estimated. But Jill says, don't jump to conclusions.
That doesn't mean it's wrong though, because as we know, these things are almost impossible to calculate.
Well, when we spoke to British Airways about its calculator, it told us it stands by its accuracy, but says it's adjusted to reflect carbon credits already paid for by the company as a whole, as well as other technical factors, which are still a matter of some debate in the scientific community. And Ryanair told us its customers' flat-rate donations go to environmental schemes in Uganda, Portugal and Ireland. And in 2020, they will offer the choice of offsetting the full carbon cost of a specific flight. And while for now all this might still seem rather confusing, Jill says the key point to remember is that carbon offsetting is now a real option for many of us, and it genuinely can be a positive thing if you're interested in doing something about the CO2 your travel creates. So while calculating your carbon footprint isn't necessarily an exact science yet, that doesn't mean you should write it off.
I would say that if you are going to fly, try to fly with a greener airline, but more importantly, do try to fly less. Switch to trains, switch to trips in the UK. But that doesn't mean that you need to give up flying altogether, because the reality is that travel is socially and culturally enriching in so many ways. And for communities that you're going to visit, they quite often rely so much on tourism. So yes, try to reduce the amount of flights that you take, but at the same time, don't beat yourself up about taking one flight a year.
For his part, Stuart is keen to do the right thing, but he would like airlines to make it easier.
So when I came on this trip, I really didn't know much about carbon offsetting. I didn't know what it was all about. I think it's become much clearer, but what would be nice is if